At 80, she was thrown out with nothing until her dog uncovered what had been hidden for decades. The day Evelyn Ward stood on the curb with a single suitcase, the front door closing behind her, she believed her life had quietly ended. No savings, no home, just an old German shepherd pressed against her leg and a county auction listing no one else wanted. The house she bought for $1 was barely standing. But beneath its broken floorboards, something waited, something no one had ever meant to be found. If you were in her place at 80, would you start over or give up? Tell me honestly in the comments. The door didn't slam. It closed slowly, almost carefully, as if whoever stood on the other side wanted to avoid the sound of finality. But Evelyn Ward heard it anyway. The soft click of the latch settling into place carried louder than any bang. It echoed in her chest, in her bones, in the quiet space where 40 years of living had once felt permanent. She stood on the curb, unmoving. The late afternoon light stretched long across the street, casting thin shadows over the familiar sidewalks of her suburban Ohio neighborhood. It was the same street where she had once watched her son learn to ride a bicycle, where she had waved goodbye to him on his first day of school, where Christmas lights had hung year after year from the gutters she used to clean herself. Now the house behind her looked smaller. Or maybe it just wasn't hers anymore. Evelyn tightened her grip on the handle of her suitcase. The leather was cracked, the edges worn soft from decades of use, and it had belonged to her husband once, back when they used to travel to small lakeside towns in the summer, back when packing it meant something hopeful. Now it held everything she had been allowed to take. A few clothes, a framed photograph wrapped in a towel, her medications, that was all. At her side, Rex leaned gently into her leg. The German shepherd didn't bark. He didn't pace or pull at the leash. He simply stood there, pressed close, his warm body steady against her hip. His ears were alert, his eyes fixed on the closed door, as if he were waiting for it to open again. It didn't. Evelyn didn't look back right away. She kept her gaze forward across the street, where Mrs. Harper's curtains shifted slightly. A shape moved behind the glass, watching, then disappearing. 2 houses down, but a man pretended to check his mailbox longer than necessary. A car slowed as it passed, then kept going. No one came over. No one asked if she was all right. It wasn't cruelty. Not exactly. It was something quieter, something easier. Avoidance. After a moment, Evelyn turned her head. The house stood there the same as it always had. White siding, blue shutters, the small garden she had planted along the front walkway now beginning to fade with the season. The wind stirred the last of the summer flowers, bending them slightly toward the porch, where she had once sat every morning with her coffee. She noticed the porch light was already on. Her son had always done that. Turned it on too early, long before dusk. He said it made the house feel lived in. Now it just made it feel closed. Not for a second, just a second, she thought she saw movement through the front window. A shadow passing by, just out of sight. She held her breath without meaning to, but no one came to the door. No one said her name. Rex shifted beside her, letting out a low, uncertain breath. His tail brushed lightly against her leg, not wagging, just there, waiting like he always did. Evelyn reached down and rested her hand on his head. His fur was warm, solid, real. "You're still here," she murmured, barely above a whisper. Rex leaned into her touch, eyes lifting to meet hers for a brief moment, before flicking back toward the house. He was watching it, still expecting something. Evelyn followed his gaze once more, then slowly shook her head. "No," she said softly, though it wasn't clear whether she was speaking to him or to herself. "Oh, no. That's done." The word felt strange. Done. As if something that had taken a lifetime to build could be reduced to a single, quiet ending. She straightened, pulling her coat a little tighter around her shoulders. The air carried the first edge of evening cool, the kind that crept in early this time of year. It slipped through the fabric, settling against her skin in a way that made her suddenly aware of how thin it was, how unprepared she was. Her eyes drifted down the street again. Everything looked the same. The same cracked pavement, the same row of mailboxes, the same distant hum of traffic from the main road. Life was continuing exactly as it always had. Only now she stood outside of it, not part of it anymore. Evelyn took a step forward, and the suitcase wheels rattled softly against the uneven curb as she pulled it behind her. Rex moved with her immediately, staying close, his shoulder brushing her leg with every step. She didn't look back again. Not at the house, not at the porch, not at the door that had closed so quietly, it almost felt polite. They reached the end of the driveway, then the sidewalk beyond it. The space between her and the house grew with each step, though it didn't feel like distance. It felt like something else, like being erased. The sun dipped lower, casting the neighborhood in a dim, fading glow. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A screen door slammed 2 houses over. Ordinary sounds, familiar sounds, but none of them belonged to her anymore. Evelyn stopped at the corner. For a moment, she didn't move. No, she stood there with her suitcase, her hand resting on Rex's back, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. There was no destination waiting ahead of her, no plan, no place to go, just the road. Rex shifted again, pressing closer, as if he could feel the stillness settling into her. Evelyn inhaled slowly. Then, without turning around, she stepped forward and crossed the street. The house behind her disappeared from view, and just like that, the life she had lived for 40 years was no longer something she could return to. It was something she had already left behind. The wind picked up as Evelyn reached the next block, carrying with it the faint scent of dry leaves and distant chimney smoke. It brushed against her face, cool and unfamiliar, as if even the air had changed the moment she stepped away from her own front yard. But Rex stayed close, his steady presence the only constant in a world that had shifted too quickly to understand. They walked without direction. The sidewalk stretched ahead, lined with houses that looked almost identical, trimmed lawns, parked cars, porch lights flickering on as evening settled in. It should have felt familiar. It should have felt like home. But it didn't. Evelyn slowed her pace, her hand tightening around the suitcase handle as something inside her mind began to stir. Not the sharp pain of what had just happened, but something quieter, older. A memory. It came back in fragments at first. A dining table. Late afternoon sunlight spilling across polished wood. Her son sitting across from her, sleeves rolled up, speaking gently. Too gently. "Mom, it's just paperwork." She could still hear the tone in his voice. Calm, just reassuring, patient, like he was explaining something simple. "It'll make things easier later. No probate, no confusion. You won't have to worry about anything." At the time, she had nodded. Of course she had. Why wouldn't she? He was her son. Evelyn paused near a street lamp, the metal pole humming faintly above her as the light flickered on. She shifted her grip on the suitcase and looked down at Rex. He glanced up briefly, then continued scanning the quiet street, alert, but calm. "You remember that day?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. Rex's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. She exhaled slowly. It hadn't felt like a decision back then. It had felt like a formality. They had sat together in the living room, her living room, papers spread neatly across the coffee table. Her son had brought a pen, had even pointed to where she needed to sign. She remembered how carefully he had arranged everything, how confident he had seemed. "All we're doing is putting the house in both our names," he'd said. "It protects you." Protects you. The words lingered now, heavy and hollow. Evelyn resumed walking, slower this time. She could still see the way the afternoon light had fallen across those papers, the way she had adjusted her glasses, leaning forward just slightly to read the lines. Legal language. Dense, unfamiliar. She hadn't understood all of it, but she hadn't questioned it either. She had spent most of her life working with documents, records, filings, forms that passed through her hands day after day in the municipal office downtown. She had always believed in order, in systems, in the idea that things were written down because they mattered. And maybe that was why she hadn't looked closer. Because she trusted what was written. Because she trusted him. The memory sharpened. She remembered the pen in her hand, the slight tremor in her fingers, not from doubt, but from age. She remembered him smiling when she signed, The way he had gathered the papers quickly afterward, stacking them with practiced ease. "See?" he'd said. "That wasn't so bad." She had smiled back. Now, standing under a streetlight with nowhere to go, the memory felt different. Not wrong. Just incomplete. Evelyn stopped again, her breath catching slightly as the realization settled deeper than before. She hadn't read everything. Not really. She had skimmed, trusted, signed. The sidewalk stretched empty in both directions. A car passed at the far end of the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across her and Rex before disappearing around the corner. Rex shifted closer, brushing against her leg. Evelyn placed her hand on his back, grounding herself in the warmth of him. "You were there," she said quietly. And he had been. He had lain by the window that afternoon, half asleep, lifting his head only when voices rose slightly, or chairs moved. He had watched, the way he always did, present, observant, silent. A witness. After her husband died, Rex had become part of the rhythm of her days. Morning walks, evenings on the porch, the quiet companionship that filled the spaces words couldn't reach. He had seen everything, though he understood none of it the way she did. Or maybe he understood more than she gave him credit for, when Evelyn's gaze drifted back toward the direction they had come from, though the house was no longer visible from here. 40 years. She had lived in that house longer than she had lived anywhere else. Longer than she had lived in the home she grew up in. Longer than any place she had ever called hers. And she had signed it away in less than 10 minutes. The thought didn't bring anger. Not yet. It brought something else. A quiet, steady disbelief. "How does something like that happen?" she whispered, more to the evening air than to Rex. He looked up again, his dark eyes searching her face. Evelyn gave a faint, almost apologetic smile. "I suppose I thought I had more time," she said. Time to ask questions. Time to understand. Time to see what was coming. But time had moved differently than she expected, and a breeze rustled through the trees lining the street, sending a scatter of dry leaves across the pavement. One brushed against her shoe before skittering away. Evelyn adjusted the strap of her coat, pulling it tighter around her shoulders. The chill was settling in now. Not sharp, not yet, but steady, like everything else. She took another step forward, then another. There was no clear destination waiting for her. No place she could picture just ahead. Only movement. Only the quiet determination not to stand still too long in one place. Rex moved with her, his pace matching hers exactly. Behind them, the street remained unchanged, lights turning on, doors closing, lives continuing. Ahead, the road stretched into something uncertain. And somewhere between the two, Chetta Evelyn carried the weight of a decision she hadn't fully understood, until now. The paper she trusted had done its job. It had changed everything. She just hadn't known it at the time. By the time the sky turned a deep, fading blue, Evelyn had reached the edge of town. The sidewalks thinned out first, then disappeared entirely. Streetlights grew farther apart, their glow weaker, as if the city itself had decided not to follow her any farther. The houses gave way to empty lots, then to small commercial buildings with darkened windows and peeling paint. Evelyn slowed near a bus stop bench, lowering herself carefully onto the cold metal. The suitcase rested upright beside her. Rex sat close, his body angled slightly outward, watching the quiet road as if guarding something invisible. She exhaled, long and steady. For the first time since leaving the house, she allowed herself to stop. A newspaper lay folded at the far end of the bench, its edges damp from the evening air. Someone had left it behind, forgotten or discarded. Evelyn glanced at it without much interest at first. Just another object in a day filled with things that no longer belonged to her. But then her eyes caught a line of text printed in bold. County auction. Abandoned properties. Starting bid. $1. She leaned forward slightly. The paper crinkled softly as she pulled it closer, smoothing it against her lap, with hands that moved slower than they used to, but still steady. Rex shifted beside her, watching her face now instead of the road. Evelyn read carefully. The auction was scheduled for the following afternoon. A list of properties followed, addresses she didn't recognize, descriptions that were brief and clinical. Condemned, uninhabitable, structural damage, no utilities. Words meant to discourage, words meant to warn people away. Her eyes lingered on one listing near the bottom. Former residential structure, Industrial Valley region, significant deterioration, access limited. No photos, no details beyond that. Evelyn stared at the words longer than necessary. Around her, the night deepened. A distant truck rumbled past on the highway. Somewhere nearby, a door slammed shut. The world continued, indifferent. She folded the paper slowly, her mind moving through something quiet and deliberate. No one could take what she didn't have. The thought came without drama, without anger, just clarity. She had nothing left to protect, nothing left to lose. Evelyn looked down at Rex, her fingers brushing lightly against the side of his neck. "What do you think?" she asked softly. Rex tilted his head slightly, ears twitching at her voice. He didn't understand the words, but he stayed. That was enough. The next day arrived gray and overcast, the kind of sky that flattened everything beneath it. The county administration building stood at the far end of a wide parking lot, its brick exterior worn by decades of weather and neglect. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, casting a pale, uneven glow across rows of folding chairs. Evelyn stepped in quietly, Rex at her side. Conversations filled the room, low, confident, familiar. Men in pressed shirts and clean shoes stood in small groups, speaking in terms she recognized but did not belong to anymore. Square footage, resale value, structural estimates. They barely noticed her. A few glanced in her direction, their expressions shifting briefly. Curiosity, then dismissal. An elderly woman with a suitcase and a dog was not competition. Evelyn found a seat near the back and sat down without a word. Rex settled beside her, calm but alert. At the front of the room, a man in his 50s shuffled through a stack of papers, clearing his throat. "All right, folks," he called out. "Let's get started." The auction moved quickly. Properties were announced one by one. Addresses, conditions, minimum bids. Hands went up, numbers climbed, deals were made in seconds. Evelyn watched. She listened. She learned. Each property passed like a moment she wasn't meant to hold on to. Until finally, "Next item," the auctioneer said, glancing down at his sheet. Property located in the Old Valley Ridge Industrial Zone, former residence, severe structural damage, no utilities, access road not maintained." A few chuckles rippled through the room. "Starting bid is $1? Silence. No hands, no movement. Someone near the front shook his head. "Not worth the trouble," another muttered. The auctioneer waited a moment longer, scanning the room. "Do I have $1? Still nothing. Evelyn felt something shift inside her. Not sudden, not impulsive, just decided. She stood. The movement drew attention immediately. Heads turned, conversations paused. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but clear. $1. For a second, no one reacted. Then the laughter started. Not loud at first, just scattered, disbelieving, but it spread quickly. Is she serious? She won't last a night out there. That place should have been torn down years ago." Evelyn didn't respond. She stood there, steady, her hand resting lightly on the handle of her suitcase. Rex remained at her side, unmoving, his gaze fixed forward. The auctioneer hesitated, studying her. "Ma'am," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "You understand the condition of this property?" Evelyn met his eyes. "Yes." "You understand it's not livable?" "Yes." Another pause. The room quieted just enough to hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights. The auctioneer looked around once more. "Any other bids?" No one spoke. "Going once?" A few smirks. "Going twice?" Someone shook their head, amused. "Sold." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed briefly through the room. Evelyn didn't flinch, and she walked forward slowly, each step measured, the sound of her shoes soft against the worn tile floor. Rex followed without hesitation. At the front table, she opened her wallet. $1. A single bill, slightly creased, but intact. She placed it down carefully. The auctioneer slid the paperwork toward her. Name? Evelyn Ward. He wrote it down, then passed her a pen. She signed without hesitation. No one laughed now. Not really. They were watching instead. Curious. Confused. Maybe even a little unsettled. Evelyn gathered the papers, folded them neatly, and placed them inside her suitcase. When she turned to leave, the room parted slightly. Not out of respect, but out of something quieter. Uncertainty. Rex walked beside her as they moved toward the exit. Behind them, the voices started up again. Conversations resumed, deals continued, as if nothing had happened. But something had. Outside, the air felt colder. Evelyn stepped into it without hesitation, the documents tucked safely away. She had spent $1, and for the first time since the door had closed behind her, she owned something again. The paper felt thin in her hand as she stood in the parking lot outside the county building. It was just ink and signatures and a property description that sounded more like a warning than a welcome. Former residence. Severe structural damage. No utilities. Evelyn folded it carefully and placed it back inside her suitcase. The address was written in small print near the bottom of the page. Valley Ridge Industrial Zone. She knew the area by reputation, not by memory. It had once been the backbone of the county. Steel. Rail. Warehouses that ran day and night. Now it was mostly quiet. She found a bus route that would take her halfway there. The rest, she was told by the driver, would require walking. You sure you want off here? The driver asked, as the bus hissed to a stop near a cracked stretch of pavement flanked by weeds and rusted fencing. Yes, Evelyn said simply. Rex stepped down first, paws landing firmly on the asphalt. He scanned the open space immediately, ears alert, tail low but steady. The bus doors closed behind them, and the vehicle pulled away, leaving a sudden and noticeable silence in its wake. The road ahead narrowed into a 2-lane stretch lined with broken streetlights and abandoned loading docks. The steel mill in the distance stood like a skeleton against the gray sky, towers and beams frozen in place, while windows blown out years ago. The air smelled different here. Metal. Damp earth. Old smoke embedded in brick. Evelyn walked slowly, suitcase wheels catching on uneven patches of road. Rex stayed close, his gaze sweeping left and right as if measuring the space. They followed the address numbers along the cracked fence posts until the paved road thinned into gravel. Beyond it, the land dipped slightly into a shallow valley framed by trees that had grown wild and untended. And there it was. The house. It stood alone, tilted slightly to one side as though exhausted from holding itself upright for too long. The roof sagged in the middle, shingles missing in jagged patches. One window was boarded, another shattered. The front steps leaned away from the porch, separated by a visible gap. Evelyn stopped. Rex did too. He didn't move forward. Instead, he stood stiffly beside her, his body angled toward the structure. His ears were high now, his breathing slower, controlled. It's all right, Evelyn said softly, though she wasn't sure whether she meant it for him or herself. The wind moved through the tall grass round the foundation, whispering against the warped siding. Up close, the house looked worse. The porch railing was half collapsed. The front door hung slightly crooked in its frame. The paint, what little remained, had peeled down to raw wood in long, uneven strips. This was what $1 bought. Evelyn stepped forward. Rex didn't follow. He stayed at the edge of the yard, muscles taut, watching the structure with focused intensity. She paused and looked back at him. Come on, she said gently. He took a few steps forward, but stopped again at the bottom of the porch steps. His paws remained planted. Evelyn studied him for a moment. In all the years she had known him, Rex had never hesitated to enter a building. Not the vet's office, not the hardware store. not her own home. But here, something held him back. She turned her gaze back to the house. It didn't look haunted or sinister, just broken, forgotten. Still, the way Rex stood there made the silence feel heavier. Evelyn placed her foot on the first step. The wood creaked sharply beneath her weight, but held. She gripped the railing lightly and climbed the remaining steps slowly, aware of each shift beneath her shoes. At the door, she reached out and pushed gently. It opened with resistance, scraping against the warped floorboards. The interior was darker than she expected. Dust floated in the thin beam of daylight cutting through the broken window. The air inside felt cooler, stale, unmoving. She stepped across the threshold. The floor groaned. Behind her, Rex let out a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine. Evelyn turned. He was still outside, watching. "It's just wood and nails," she said quietly. "Nothing more." But even as she said it, she felt the weight of the place. The living room, if it could still be called that, was stripped down to its bones. Wallpaper hung in torn strips. The fireplace was blackened with old soot. A section of ceiling had caved in near the corner, exposing dark beams above. The floor beneath her feet shifted again. She moved carefully, testing each step. There was no electricity, no sound of traffic, no neighbors, just wind pressing softly against the walls and the distant hum of the valley. Evelyn walked slowly through the main room and into what might have once been a kitchen. The cabinets were broken. The sink rusted through. The pipes beneath it had long since been removed. She stood still for a moment. This was not a home. Not yet. But it was hers. Outside, Rex finally stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath his weight as he approached the doorway. He stopped there, half in, half out. His nose lifted slightly, testing the air. Then cautiously, he stepped inside. His movements were deliberate now, slower than usual. He walked the perimeter of the room once, sniffing along the walls, the corners, the floor. He did not relax. Evelyn watched him carefully. "What is it?" she asked under her breath. But Rex paused near the far wall, where the ceiling dip had cast a shadow over part of the floor. He lowered his head slightly, nostrils flaring. Then he looked up at her. Not frightened, just alert, as if something beneath the surface had caught his attention. Evelyn stepped closer to him. The boards beneath that section felt slightly uneven, softer than the rest. She pressed her foot down lightly. The wood dipped almost imperceptibly. "Old house," she murmured. She didn't press further. Instead, she walked toward the window and pushed aside a loose board to let in more light. The afternoon sun filtered through, illuminating the floating dust and highlighting the cracks in the walls. The place was worse than she imagined. But standing there, in the quiet, she felt something else. Not fear. Not yet. It was something closer to tension, like the beginning of a test she hadn't studied for. She turned back toward the doorway. "We'll manage," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty pressing in around her. Rex remained near the shadowed section of floor, watching. The house creaked softly, settling into itself as the wind shifted outside. It wasn't welcoming. It wasn't warm. But it was standing. And for now, so was she. The first night settled in fast. By the time the sun slipped behind the trees lining the valley, the house had already surrendered what little warmth it held. The air inside cooled quickly, seeping through cracked window frames and the exposed gap in the ceiling. Shadows stretched across the warped floorboards, swallowing the corners of the room. Evelyn moved slowly, deliberate with every step. She found an old broom leaning behind a broken door and used it to sweep a clear patch of floor near the least damaged wall. Dust lifted into the air in soft gray clouds, making her cough lightly. But she didn't stop. Rex followed her movements carefully, watching each corner as though the walls themselves might shift. By the time the light faded completely, she had cleared enough space to lay down a folded blanket from her suitcase. It wasn't much, but it was something. She sat down carefully, easing herself onto the fabric with a controlled breath. Her knees protested. Her back ached in a way that reminded her of age more than effort. Rex circled once before settling beside her, his body pressed along her side, warm and solid. The wind brushed against the exterior walls, slipping through cracks and thin whistles. And somewhere in the distance, metal clanged faintly, loose sheet iron shifting in the abandoned mill yard. Evelyn leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. This was not the porch swing, not the quiet hum of her refrigerator, not the faint ticking of the hallway clock she had listened to for years. This was something else entirely. The cold crept upward from the floorboards first, slow and patient. Rex shifted closer. She rested her hand against his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "We'll get through tonight," she whispered. Morning came pale and sharp. The chill in the air had deepened overnight, settling into her bones. When she opened her eyes, faint light was filtering through the broken window. Rex was already awake, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Evelyn pushed herself upright slowly, wincing as stiffness caught in her shoulders. The house looked different in daylight, less threatening, more exposed. She stood and began her assessment. There was no running water. The sink pipes were gone entirely. The stove was rusted beyond repair. Electrical wires hung loose from sections of ceiling. But the walls, for the most part, held. The roof sagged, but it hadn't collapsed entirely. The foundation felt uneven in places, but not completely unstable. It was damaged, not destroyed. Evelyn stepped outside to the yard. The grass reached nearly to her calves, wild and untrimmed. Behind the house, a shallow slope led toward a cluster of trees. Beyond that, she could hear the faint trickle of water. Rex moved ahead of her now, more confident outdoors than inside. His nose dropped low, tracking something invisible along the ground. "Don't go too far," she called gently. He stopped immediately and looked back. The sound of running water drew her forward. She followed the slope carefully, gripping onto tree trunks when necessary. At the base, partially hidden by brush, a narrow creek cut through the earth. The water was clear, cold. She crouched slowly, dipping her fingers into it. The temperature stung slightly, but it was clean. "That's something," she murmured. Back at the house, she gathered an empty container from her suitcase and returned to the creek. The process was slow, cautious, but by midday, she had a small supply of water set near the wall inside. Rex lay nearby, watching her work. The day unfolded in measured effort, and she boarded up the worst of the broken window with loose planks she found stacked near the porch. Each nail took patience. Her hands trembled slightly with exertion, but she finished what she started. The sun climbed higher, warming the exterior just enough to make movement easier. By late afternoon, she realized she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Her stomach tightened quietly, not with panic, but with reminder. She locked the front door as best she could, wedging a heavy board against it, and made her way back toward the main road with Rex at her side. The scrapyard sat half a mile away, its metal fence bent inward in places. Stacks of rusted parts and old car frames filled the yard. A man stood near the entrance, leaning against a forklift. He looked up as she approached. "You lost?" he asked, not unkindly. "Oh, no," Evelyn replied. "I'm nearby." He glanced down at Rex, who stood still but attentive. "Place down the valley?" "Yes." The man nodded slowly, as if that explained something. "What do you need?" Evelyn hesitated only a second. "Work," she said. "Something small." He studied her face for a moment, then looked toward the yard. "You can sort the lighter scrap," he said finally. "Separate copper from steel. I'll give you a few dollars." It wasn't generosity. It wasn't charity. It was a transaction. And that mattered. She nodded. The work was simple but tiring. She moved slowly, careful not to strain herself too far. Rex lay in the shade nearby, watching as trucks came and went. By sunset, she had earned enough for a small bag of groceries from the corner store near the bus stop. Bread, canned beans, a small pack of tea. But when she returned to the house that evening, her steps were slower, but steadier. She set the food down on the cleared patch of floor. "Small wins," she whispered. Rex wagged his tail lightly for the first time since arriving. Night fell again, colder than the last. But this time she had water, food, a boarded window, a door secured. The house creaked as the temperature dropped, but it no longer felt entirely hostile. Rex curled beside her, his body angled toward the section of floor near the shadowed corner once more. He remained alert longer than usual, watching, listening. Evelyn noticed, but said nothing. The day had cost her strength, but it had given her something back. Not comfort, not safety, but progress. And in the quiet darkness of the ruined house, progress was enough. At least, that was what Evelyn told herself. The wind moved differently that night. It no longer sounded like distant metal shifting or branches scraping against siding. It felt closer, thinner, as if the house itself were breathing in uneven rhythm. Rex did not settle. He lay beside her at first, as he had the night before, but his body stayed tense. His ears flicked toward the far wall every few seconds. His breathing remained shallow, alert. Evelyn noticed. She had learned to read him long ago. Small shifts, subtle signals, the way his muscles tightened before a storm rolled in, the way he positioned himself between her and strangers before she ever sensed danger. Now he rose quietly. He walked across the room toward the sagging corner of the floor, the same shadowed section he had watched since they arrived. His nose lowered. He sniffed along the boards. Then he scratched once, not hard, just enough to make a faint rasping sound against the wood. "Rex," she murmured gently. "Leave it." He stopped immediately and looked back at her, but he didn't return. Instead, he lay down beside that spot, his body angled toward it, head resting just inches from the floor. Watching. Morning light slipped through the boarded window, pale and muted. Evelyn rose stiffly and stretched her back with care. She prepared a small breakfast, bread and tea warmed over a simple camping burner she had purchased the day before with the last of her scrapyard earnings. Rex didn't eat right away. He stood and walked back to the corner. He sniffed again. Scratched twice this time. Evelyn paused mid-step. "Is there something in there?" she asked, her voice thoughtful rather than worried. Old houses carried sounds. Mice, settling beams, moisture shifting beneath floorboards. It could be anything. She set the kettle down and walked over slowly. The boards beneath her feet creaked softly. The section Rex focused on looked no different from the rest at first glance. Dusty, warped slightly with age, a faint dip along the seam where two planks met. She pressed her foot gently on the surface. It flexed, more than it should have. Rex let out a low sound. Not a growl, but something closer to insistence. Evelyn knelt slowly, careful of her knees, and ran her fingers along the cracks in the wood. The boards felt slightly looser than the rest, as though something beneath them had shifted. "You've been watching this since we got here," she murmured. While Rex's tail flicked once against the floor. She rose carefully and retrieved a small pry bar she had picked up at the scrapyard, a tool someone had discarded as useless. Back at the corner, she wedged the thin metal edge between the planks. The wood resisted at first. Then, with a sharp creak, one board lifted slightly. Dust puffed upward. Rex immediately stepped forward, nose lowering toward the gap. Evelyn lifted the board fully. Beneath it, only dirt, dark compacted soil. She leaned closer, examining it carefully. Nothing obvious, no object, no visible structure, just earth. She replaced the board halfway and exhaled. "Just ground," she said quietly. But Rex did not move away. He scratched again, this time not at the wood, but at the exposed soil beneath. The sound was soft but deliberate, and Evelyn watched him for a long moment. "Enough," she said gently. Rex stopped, but he did not leave. The rest of the day passed in steady effort. She patched another small gap in the roof using flattened scrap metal and tar she had traded for. She reinforced the doorframe. She swept the floor again. Yet every time she passed the corner, Rex was there, watching, waiting. By the third night, the pattern had become undeniable. He would eat. He would walk the perimeter. And then he would return to that spot. He no longer scratched constantly. Instead, he would lie beside it, head lowered, eyes fixed on the floor as if listening for something beneath it. The tension in him was different now. Not fear. focus. Evelyn sat beside him that evening, her back resting against the wall. "You're certain about this, aren't you?" she asked softly. Rex lifted his head slightly. Outside, the wind had begun to build. Clouds rolled thick and low over the valley, darkening the sky earlier than usual. A distant rumble carried through the air. Thunder, faint but growing. The house responded to the shift in weather. Beams creaked more sharply. Loose boards rattled. Rain began in thin drops, tapping lightly against the patched sections of roof. Evelyn felt the change in pressure in her joints. Storms were harder on her these days. Rex stood suddenly. He moved to the corner again, faster this time, and began scratching with more urgency. Not wild, not panicked, just determined. "Rex!" she called, sharper now. He barked once. It was not a warning bark. It was a call. The storm intensified without pause. Rain hammered the roof in uneven bursts, and a wind pressed hard against the walls, forcing thin drafts through cracks she hadn't yet sealed. The house groaned under the pressure. Evelyn rose carefully, gripping the wall for balance as the floor shifted beneath her. Rex continued scratching. The soil beneath the loosened board had begun to crumble slightly from the vibration of the storm, and then a sharp crack echoed from beneath her feet. The board dipped suddenly. Not fully, but enough. Evelyn stumbled backward, catching herself against the wall. The storm roared overhead. Rex barked again, louder this time. The floor in that corner sagged noticeably now, the dirt beneath shifting in small slides. Evelyn's pulse quickened. This was no mouse, no simple settling. Something beneath the house was giving way. She grabbed the pry bar again and returned to the corner. "Back!" she said firmly. Rex stepped aside but remained inches away. The board lifted easier this time. The soil beneath had hollowed slightly in one section. Rain pounded harder against the roof. Another deep creak echoed through the structure. And then the weakened section of floor collapsed inward with a heavy thud, sending dirt and splintered wood downward into darkness. Evelyn froze. The storm raged above. Rex stood at the edge of the opening, staring into the shadowed space below. Not frightened, not confused, but certain. The air rising from the hole felt colder than the room around it. Evelyn stepped closer, peering down. Beneath the house, there was space. Not just earth, not just a shallow crawl space, but something deeper. Rex leaned forward and barked once more. He had not been wrong. He had not let it go, and now, the house that shouldn't stand was no longer just a house. The storm pressed hard against the valley, rain striking the roof in uneven bursts. Wind pushed through the broken seams of the siding, slipping across the floor in cold drafts. The room smelled of wet earth and old wood. Evelyn stood at the edge of the collapse, her breath shallow, the pry bar still clenched in her hand. Rex leaned forward, peering into the opening. He did not bark again. He simply stared, his ears upright, his body tense with purpose. The hole wasn't large, no wider than a small coffee table, but it was deep enough that the bottom wasn't immediately clear. Rainwater from the storm above seeped through cracks in the ceiling and trickled down, darkening the soil beneath. Evelyn knelt carefully, gripping the wall to steady herself. "Easy," she murmured, unsure if she was calming Rex or herself. She leaned forward and squinted into the shadow. There was more than dirt down there. A shape, metal, partially buried beneath soil that had likely been compacted for decades. Her heart thudded once, harder than the storm overhead. Rex shifted closer, lowering his nose toward the gap, inhaling deeply. Evelyn stood and moved quickly to retrieve her flashlight from the suitcase. It was small and worn, but reliable. She clicked it on and returned to the opening, angling the beam downward. The light cut through the darkness in a narrow line. And there it was. A rusted metal surface, flat, circular at one edge, not random scrap, not debris. A hatch. The soil around it had eroded enough to expose the outer rim, but the center remained partially buried. Evelyn stared. "This was covered," she whispered. Not naturally. Intentionally. The storm rattled the walls again, shaking loose small flecks of plaster from the ceiling. The house groaned, but it held. Rex let out a low, steady sound, not alarmed, but insistent. Evelyn set the flashlight down carefully and widened the opening around the hatch using the pry bar. Each movement was slow, deliberate. Soil crumbled easily now, damp from the rain and weakened by the collapse. Her arms trembled with effort, but she did not stop. Minutes passed, maybe more. The storm masked the sound of her work. Eventually, the hatch was fully exposed. It was solid steel, round, with a thick lip around its edge. A heavy hinge ran along one side. On the opposite end, a metal ring handle lay flat against the surface, coated in rust. There were no markings, no labels, just weight. Evelyn sat back on her heels. This did not belong to the house she had walked through. This was older, or at least built with purpose. Rex moved closer, sniffing along the metal rim. He pawed once at the handle. Evelyn brushed dirt from the ring with her sleeve. The metal felt cold even through the fabric. She wrapped her fingers around it. It did not move. She tried again, adjusting her grip, bracing one knee against the floor for leverage. Still nothing. The hatch had likely not been opened in years, maybe decades. The storm above intensified again, thunder cracking sharply across the valley. The sound reverberated through the foundation, vibrating faintly beneath her feet. Evelyn paused. She listened. The rain, the wind, the creaking beams, and beneath it all, stillness. She tightened her grip on the ring and pulled with both hands. The metal resisted at first. Then, a sharp, grating sound split the air as the seal gave way. The hatch lifted an inch. Dirt fell inward. Rex stepped back slightly, but did not retreat. Evelyn adjusted her position and pulled again. The hinge shrieked under the strain, but slowly, steadily, the heavy lid rose. A rush of colder air pushed upward from the darkness below. The smell was different. Not decay, not rot, just earth, dry and enclosed. She held the hatch open with effort and angled the flashlight beam downward once more. The light revealed a narrow shaft descending several feet below the floor. The walls were lined with old concrete, rough but structured. Thus, this was not a simple crawl space. It was built. At the base of the shaft, a short metal ladder extended downward into a small underground chamber. Rex leaned forward again, his gaze fixed. Evelyn felt the weight of the moment settle into her chest. The house had not simply collapsed into random ground. It had uncovered something constructed, something placed. The storm above began to weaken slightly, rain shifting from heavy sheets to steady fall. The house no longer shook as violently. Evelyn kept the hatch open with one hand while holding the flashlight steady with the other. The beam swept across the base of the chamber. Wooden crates, metal containers, neatly arranged, not scattered, not forgotten in chaos. Stored. Her breath caught. This was not debris from a broken home. This was something preserved. Rex let out a low sound again, stepping back slightly, as if giving her space. Evelyn slowly lowered the hatch back down, not fully closed, but resting loosely over the opening. The storm would pass soon, and climbing down into that space in the dark would be unwise. She stood carefully, her knees stiff from kneeling. The room felt different now. Not just ruined, not just abandoned, but layered. The house had been built above something, protected something. Rex returned to her side, his body no longer tense but steady, resolved. "You knew," she said quietly. He looked up at her, eyes calm. The storm outside softened into a distant rumble. Evelyn glanced once more at the partially covered hatch. The floor around it would need reinforcing. The opening would need widening. But not tonight. Tonight, she would wait, and she gathered the flashlight and secured the loose boards around the collapse as best she could to prevent further damage. The house settled again into relative quiet. But it was not the same quiet as before. It held expectation now. Evelyn sat down slowly against the wall once more, Rex curling beside her. The storm had revealed more than weakness. It had revealed intent. And beneath the broken boards of a house no one wanted, There was a door. The storm moved east before dawn, leaving the valley washed clean and strangely quiet. Water dripped from the edges of the roof in slow, patient rhythms. The air smelled of wet soil and old timber. Evelyn woke before the light fully reached the windows. For a moment, she forgot. Then she saw the uneven boards near the corner of the room and remembered everything. Yet Rex was already awake, sitting upright, eyes fixed on the partially covered hatch. He did not look restless. He looked expectant. "All right," she said quietly. She rose slowly, her body reminding her of the effort from the night before. She heated water for tea and ate half a slice of bread without much taste. Her mind remained on the floor across the room. The house felt still now, not threatening, waiting. She moved the loose boards aside again, careful not to widen the damage unnecessarily. The metal hatch sat where she had left it, dull and heavy. Rex stood beside her. "Stay," she said softly. He obeyed immediately, but did not look away. Evelyn positioned the flashlight at her belt and lifted the hatch fully this time. The hinge protested, but held. The shaft below appeared darker in the daylight, now as though it refused to share its secrets easily. The metal ladder looked intact, though thin with age. She tested it first with her hand. Solid. She took a slow breath and lowered one foot onto the first rung. The descent was careful and deliberate. Her hands gripped each side of the ladder as though greeting something unknown but not unwelcome. The air below was cooler than the room above. Still. She reached the bottom and stepped onto packed earth reinforced with concrete edges. The chamber was small, no larger than a modest storage room, but its structure was unmistakable. It had been built. Walls of rough concrete lined the space, reinforced with aging metal supports. A single exposed bulb hung from the ceiling, long dead. On one side of the room, wooden crates were stacked in precise order. On the other, metal containers sat sealed with heavy clasps. Nothing looked scattered. Nothing looked abandoned in panic. It looked preserved. Evelyn angled her flashlight across the nearest crate. Dust coated its surface, but the wood remained intact. Faded stenciled letters were barely visible across the side. She brushed her hand gently across it. The letters sharpened under her touch. VR. Supply Unit, 1944. Her pulse quickened. 44, she murmured. Rex shifted above, his nails scraping lightly against the floor as he adjusted position near the opening. Evelyn set the flashlight upright and knelt beside the crate. The lid was secured with simple metal latches, rusted but not fused shut. She hesitated only a second, then she lifted them. The hinges creaked as the lid opened. What's inside? Neatly arranged bundles wrapped in wax paper. Rolled documents bound with twine. A sealed metal cylinder resting across the top layer. She picked up one of the rolled papers and gently untied the string. It unfolded into a detailed map. Lines marked routes through the valley. Rail spurs. Warehouse notations. Symbols she recognized. Not immediately in meaning, but in structure. It was a filing system. Precise. Ordered. She moved to the metal containers next. Each was labeled in the same faded stencil. Some contained additional documents. Others held small mechanical components. Valves, gauges, equipment pieces that seemed too specialized to belong to an ordinary residence. Nothing here was accidental. Everything had been cataloged, stored, hidden. She stood slowly and turned in a slow circle, while letting the beam of the flashlight sweep across the chamber once more. This space had been designed with intention. Not as a shelter, not as a cellar, as a vault. Above her, Rex let out a soft huff. "I see it," she called up gently. She returned her attention to the crate and selected another document, this one thicker, bound in a leather folder. When she opened it, she found typed pages, rows of coded entries, inventory lists, dates, shipments, initials. Her brow furrowed slightly. This wasn't household record-keeping. It was logistical, organized at a level that required oversight. Evelyn sat back on her heels, the flashlight casting long shadows across the chamber walls. She had worked with records her entire adult life. Birth certificates, property deeds, business filings, storage indexes. She understood patterns. Oh, and this. This followed a pattern she recognized, but she didn't fully understand it yet. She closed the folder carefully and placed it back exactly where she found it. Then she climbed the ladder slowly, emerging back into the ruined living room, with dirt on her hands and something new behind her eyes. Rex stepped aside to give her space. "Well," she said quietly. He leaned forward and sniffed her sleeve. She lowered herself onto the floor and rested her back against the wall. The house no longer felt like a test of endurance. It felt like a boundary. Above ground, it was broken. Below ground, it held something preserved for decades. Evelyn looked at the hatch again. "This wasn't forgotten," she murmured. No one had stumbled into this by accident. It had been sealed deliberately, protected from time, protected from notice. The rainwater dripping from the roof slowed to almost nothing. Sunlight began to filter faintly through the boarded window, catching dust in thin golden beams. Evelyn wiped her hands on a cloth and folded it neatly beside her. The world she had left behind had erased her quietly, but beneath this ruined house, someone had erased something else. And unlike her old home, this place had not given up its secrets easily. Rex returned to lie beside the hatch, head resting just inches from the metal lid, guarding it, not out of fear, but as if it now belonged to them. Evelyn leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes briefly. The house above still needed repair. Food still needed earning. The roof still sagged. But the valley no longer felt empty. It felt connected. So the house that shouldn't stand was standing on something far older than anyone realized. For the next 2 days, Evelyn did not rush. The hatch remained closed during daylight hours while she reinforced the damaged corner of the floor. She measured carefully, cutting salvaged planks from scrap wood she had collected behind the mill yard. She worked slowly, bracing the surrounding beams so the opening would not widen further. Rex stayed close, never straying far from the corner. But he no longer scratched. He simply waited. By the third afternoon, the floor around the hatch was stable enough to kneel beside it safely. Evelyn brought down a small folding chair she had repaired from the scrap pile. She set it carefully in the underground chamber and carried a thermos of tea with her. The space felt less threatening now, less mysterious, more deliberate. She reopened the leather-bound folder she had returned to its place and laid it across her lap. The typed entries were arranged in columns, shipment codes, dates, warehouse designations, initials. Each page carried a pattern, columns aligned in a precise order, with annotations in the margins using a small, consistent hand. Evelyn leaned closer. The structure of it tugged at her memory. Not the names, not the shipments, the formatting. Indented subsections beneath primary listings. Cross-references marked by symbols instead of words. Inventory tallies arranged in a specific numerical hierarchy. She had seen this before. Her fingers traced along the margin markings. The notation system was nearly identical to one used by the county records office during her early years as a clerk, when wartime documentation had still been stored separately from civilian filings. She could see the dusty archive room in her mind. Metal cabinets lined in rows. Folders labeled by district code. She had been responsible for reorganizing those records during a transition period when the county modernized its filing systems. She remembered thinking at the time how unnecessarily complicated some of the older systems were. Now she understood something else. They had not been complicated. They had been coded. Evelyn set the folder down and reached for one of the rolled maps. She unbound it carefully. The valley unfolded across the paper, rail lines branching like veins through the industrial district. Warehouses marked not only by street address but by numbered sector. Her house, she located it slowly, sat near a faded symbol she recognized. Sector 3B. She frowned. Sector numbers had once corresponded to supply routing points. She remembered overhearing older supervisors speak about 3B clearance when referencing certain wartime shipments. Back then, she had filed what she was given. She had not asked questions. She hadn't needed to. Now, sitting beneath the very ground where one of those sector codes rested, the pieces felt uncomfortably close. Rex shifted slightly at the top of the ladder, watching her silhouette below. She reached for another bundle of papers. These were thinner, carbon copies of delivery manifests. The ink had faded but remained legible. Destination codes matched the valley. Shipment categories were abbreviated. M parts, L units, C trans. She leaned back slowly in the chair. Her career had been modest, quiet. She had been efficient, reliable, never important. But the structure of these documents suggested something else. Her office had not merely stored records, it had filtered them, separated certain filings into secondary archives. She remembered the locked cabinet in the back room that only senior clerks had access to. She remembered being asked to re-index certain files without discussing their contents. At the time, she had accepted it as standard procedure. Now, she looked around the chamber again. This underground vault was not random storage. It was an off-site archive, one that had been deliberately concealed. Or perhaps the house above had once belonged to someone connected to the supply chain, someone who needed to secure documentation outside official oversight. Her breath felt tighter, not from fear, from recognition. She opened the metal cylinder she had seen earlier. Inside were blueprints, schematics for rail junction modifications, temporary diversions built during wartime to reroute cargo discreetly. Her eyes moved slowly across the lines. These were not small operations. They were systematic, organized, protected. Evelyn lowered the paper and rested it across her knees. All those years at her desk, all those files she had touched without fully understanding. She had believed her work was administrative, peripheral, insignificant. But these documents mirrored the very format she had helped preserve. Not her hands trembled slightly, not from age this time, but from realization. Her life had not brushed against something larger by accident. It had intersected with it. Above her, Rex let out a soft, steady breath. "You were part of it," she murmured quietly to herself. Not knowingly, not intentionally, but her quiet diligence had helped maintain the structure of this network. She had safeguarded records that tied directly to what now lay beneath her home. The house was not just standing on history, it was standing on a system she had once helped protect. Evelyn folded the blueprints carefully and returned them to the cylinder. She closed the crate lid gently, securing the latches. Her reflection in the faint metal surface looked older than she remembered. But her eyes, they were sharper. For decades, she had been background, unnoticed, routine. Now, in this underground chamber, the pattern of her life rearranged itself in a way she had never anticipated. She climbed the ladder slowly, emerging back into the quiet room above. Rex stepped forward immediately, brushing his head against her hand. She rested her palm against his neck. "I think I know why this was hidden," she said softly. The house no longer felt like shelter alone. It felt like connection. The valley outside seemed quieter than before. Not empty, but layered with stories she had once filed away without understanding their weight. Evelyn walked to the boarded window and pulled back a small gap to look outside. The abandoned rail line ran silent through the trees, but she no longer saw rust. She saw roots, paths. She saw the structure beneath the surface. And for the first time since the door had closed behind her in Ohio, she did not feel erased. She felt involved. But recognition alone was not enough. Evelyn stood at the boarded window a long time, watching the abandoned rail line cut through the valley like a scar. The pattern in the documents was clear to her, but understanding it fully required more than memory. It required verification. That evening, she climbed back down into the chamber and selected only a small portion of the materials. A single ledger, one of the rail schematics, a delivery manifest tied to Sector 3B. She wrapped them carefully in cloth and placed them inside her suitcase. Rex watched her movements with quiet focus. "You're coming with me," she said. The next morning, she took the bus back toward town. The driver recognized her this time. You settling in out there?" he asked. "I am," she replied calmly. She stepped off near the public library, a modest brick building that still stood intact despite the fading downtown around it. Inside, the air smelled of paper and old carpet. The front desk was staffed by a woman in her 40s who greeted her politely. Evelyn asked a simple question. "Is Calvin Pierce still working here?" The woman smiled slightly. "He's in the local history room, back corner." Evelyn walked slowly through the rows of shelves, Rex padding beside her without drawing attention. The history room was quiet, lined with maps, framed photographs of the steel mill in its prime, and glass cases displaying wartime memorabilia. A man in his late 60s stood near a large county map mounted on the wall. His hair was silver, on his posture slightly bent but alert. He wore reading glasses low on his nose and held a pencil between his fingers. "Calvin?" Evelyn asked. He turned. For a moment, he studied her face as though flipping through memory. "Evelyn Ward?" he said finally. She nodded. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "Records office legend." She allowed a small smile. "It's been a long time." They spoke briefly of familiar names, retired clerks, old supervisors, the modernization of county systems. Then her tone shifted. "I found something," she said quietly. He looked curious, not skeptical. "What kind of something?" She opened the suitcase carefully and removed the wrapped documents. Calvin's expression changed as soon as he saw the ledger. He stepped closer. "Where did you get this?" "In the valley," she replied. Under a house near the old rail spur." He removed his glasses and wiped them slowly, then replaced them. He opened the ledger. His eyes moved across the pages, scanning columns with increasing intensity. "This," he breathed. "This isn't civilian supply." "I know." He moved to the map she had brought next, spreading it across a table beneath brighter light. The rail modifications, the sector codes, the diversion markings. Calvin leaned heavily on the table as he studied it. "This matches rumors," he said slowly. "There were always stories about a secondary supply network operating through here during the war, but documentation was thin." "Not thin," Evelyn said softly. "Filtered." He looked at her sharply. You recognize the structure?" "Yes," she explained quietly, how the formatting matched older filing systems she had once maintained, how certain records had been re-indexed and separated without explanation. Calvin listened without interrupting. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "This is significant," he said. Rex lay quietly at Evelyn's feet, head resting across her shoe. Calvin flipped to the delivery manifest and ran his finger along the destination codes. "Sector 3B, he murmured. "That's your house." "Yes." He exhaled slowly. "If this is authentic, and it appears to be, then your property sits on what may have been an undocumented logistics vault tied to wartime rail operations." Evelyn absorbed the words without flinching. "And that means?" "It means," he said carefully, "that the land isn't just abandoned industrial runoff. It's part of recorded history. Unrecorded history, technically." He closed the ledger gently. "We'll need to verify this with county archives. Cross-reference rail permits, construction records. But Evelyn, this could change how that entire valley is understood." The word change settled heavily in the air. She did not think of money. She thought of preservation, of context, of something once hidden finally acknowledged. Calvin looked at her again. Longer this time. "You said you live there?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Then you may want to prepare for attention." 2 weeks later, the valley no longer felt isolated. County officials arrived first, quietly at first, then with measured interest. A small team from the Historical Preservation Office followed, bringing cameras and surveying tools. They descended into the chamber with careful documentation. They examined the structural integrity of the underground space. They photographed each crate, each container, each page. Evelyn stood above, Rex beside her, watching. Calvin spoke on her behalf when needed, careful to credit her discovery. "It was her dog," he said once, smiling faintly. "Persistent fellow." Rex remained steady, unbothered by the strangers moving in and out of the house. Within a month, a temporary protective designation was placed on the property. Not a seizure, not a claim, a recognition. A sign was placed discreetly near the road, identifying the site as a potential historical asset pending review. The laughter from the auction hall felt distant now. The ruin no one wanted had gained weight. Evelyn no longer rode the bus to the scrapyard for work. Instead, She spent her days answering questions, reviewing documents, helping historians interpret the filing structure she once thought ordinary. The house remained modest, still broken in places, but it was no longer invisible. One evening, as the sun lowered across the valley, Calvin stood beside her near the porch. "You realize," he said quietly, "that without you recognizing those codes, this might have stayed buried." She looked at the rail line stretching into the trees. "I didn't build it," she replied. "No," he agreed. "But you understood it." Rex sat between them, gaze fixed toward the distant trees. The valley carried a new sound now, measured voices, careful footsteps, the click of cameras. Evelyn felt something settle inside her. Not pride, exactly. Oh, something steadier. For decades, her work had been invisible. Now, the structure she once maintained in quiet offices had risen into light. The truth had not shouted. It had simply been uncovered. And this time, it had her name attached to it. The article ran on a quiet Tuesday morning. A modest headline in the regional paper. "Hidden wartime logistics vault discovered beneath abandoned valley property." Her photograph sat beside it. Not glamorous, not posed. Just Evelyn standing near the porch, Rex at her side, the house behind them patched but still visibly weathered. By noon, the valley was busier than it had been in decades. Cars rolled slowly down the gravel road. Not crowds, but curious faces. Historians, reporters, a representative from the State Preservation Office. And by late afternoon, another car. Evelyn saw it before it reached the bend. She recognized the shape immediately. The sedan she had helped pay off years ago. It stopped at the edge of the yard. The engine idled a moment longer than necessary. Then it shut off. Rex rose from where he lay near the porch steps. He did not bark. He stood, alert. The driver's door opened slowly. Her son stepped out. Daniel looked smaller than she remembered. Or perhaps it was the valley that made him look that way. He adjusted his jacket, glanced briefly toward the historical marker sign near the road, then toward the house. Toward her. Evelyn remained seated on the porch chair Calvin had helped repair. She did not stand immediately. Rex stepped forward, positioning himself halfway between her and the gravel path. Daniel noticed. "Mom," he called, attempting warmth. Oh, the word felt unfamiliar in the open air. She rose slowly, steadying herself on the railing. "Daniel?" He approached cautiously, hands visible at his sides. "I saw the article," he said. "I didn't know." She said nothing. He glanced toward the house. "They're saying it's worth something now. The land, I mean. Protected status, grants, maybe even compensation." Rex shifted slightly, his body firm but not aggressive. Daniel looked down at the dog. "He still remembers me," he said, trying to smile. Rex did not move. "I didn't come to argue," Daniel continued. I wanted to talk." Evelyn studied his face. There were lines she didn't remember, gray at his temples. He looked tired, but not uncertain, calculated. "You wanted to talk before," she said quietly. "At the house." He hesitated. "Oh, that was different." "Yes," she agreed. "It was." A breeze moved through the tall grass behind him. The valley felt wide and exposed. "I thought I was helping," he said finally. "The paperwork, the transfer, it made sense at the time." "For you," she replied. Silence settled between them. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You can't manage all this alone. The state involvement, legal matters. You'll need someone." Rex took one deliberate step forward. Daniel stopped instinctively. "I'm not here to take anything," he said quickly. "I'm your son." The words hung in the air. Evelyn felt the weight of them, not sharp, not cutting, just heavy. Behind her, the house creaked softly in the late afternoon sun. The same house no one had wanted. The same house she had bought for $1 when no one else would claim it. I needed a son when the door closed," she said gently. Daniel's expression tightened. "I was overwhelmed," he replied. You don't understand the pressure I was under." "I understand pressure," she said calmly. Rex remained steady, silent. Daniel exhaled sharply. "I'm trying to fix this." Evelyn looked past him toward the gravel road. There was no anger in her chest, no rising heat, only clarity. "You can't fix something you never saw as broken," she said. He opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. The wind shifted again. The historical marker near the road caught the light, its temporary plaque reflecting a thin silver line across the valley. Daniel followed her gaze. "You're not going to let me be part of this?" he asked. "I am part of this," she answered quietly. "You chose not to be." He stood very still. Oh, for a moment, he looked younger, uncertain in a way he hadn't allowed himself to appear before. "Mom," he tried again, softer. Rex stepped closer to Evelyn's side. Not threatening, just present. Daniel looked at the dog, then back at her. "You've changed," he said. "No," she replied. "I haven't." The house behind her held steady in the fading light. The valley felt calm. She felt calm. "I won't contest anything," Daniel said finally. "I just thought you should know I'm here." Evelyn nodded once. "I know." He lingered another moment, searching her face for something. Permission, perhaps. She did not offer it. After a long silence, he turned and walked back toward his car. Rex did not move until the engine started. When the sedan disappeared beyond the bend, the valley returned to stillness. Evelyn sat back down slowly, and her hands rested comfortably in her lap. No tremor, no doubt. Rex lay at her feet again, his head resting across her shoe. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting long shadows across the patched siding of the house. For the first time since she had stood on that Ohio curb with a suitcase in her hand, she did not feel displaced. She felt positioned, not against someone, not in defiance, but exactly where she had chosen to stand. Autumn settled slowly over the valley. The tall grass thinned and turned gold. The air sharpened in the mornings, carrying the scent of leaves and cooling earth. The abandoned rail line no longer felt forgotten. Small survey markers now lined sections of it, placed carefully by preservation teams documenting its structure. The house still leaned slightly to one side. The roof still bore patches of scrap metal and tar, but it no longer looked like it was waiting to collapse. It looked kept. Evelyn stood on the porch one early morning, a mug of tea warming her hands. Rex sat beside her, his coat thicker now against the colder air. A modest wooden sign had been installed near the road. It did not glorify the site. It simply acknowledged it. Valley Ridge Wartime Logistics Archive, under study and preservation. Her name appeared in smaller lettering beneath the description. Discoverer, Evelyn Ward. She had resisted that word at first. Discoverer. It felt too large, but Calvin had insisted gently. "You uncovered it," he had said. "That matters." Inside the house, one room had been stabilized completely. The historical team had reinforced the foundation around the underground chamber. The hatch had been restored but left functional, fitted with proper support and a safer ladder. Evelyn still climbed down herself. Not every day, but often enough. The crates had been cataloged carefully. Most remained in place while documentation continued. Some items had been transferred temporarily to secure facilities for preservation, but the chamber itself remained intact. It was not a museum. It was not transformed into something polished or commercial. It remained what it had always been. A hidden space, now acknowledged. Evelyn preferred it that way. She spent her mornings reviewing copies of documents with Calvin at the library or at her kitchen table. She no longer worked at the scrapyard. A modest stipend had been arranged for her role as site caretaker and consultant. It was not wealth. It was recognition. On some evenings, she walked along the edge of the rail spur with Rex, watching the sun fall behind the skeletal remains of the old steel mill. The valley felt different now, alive in a quiet way. Neighbors who had once driven past without slowing now waved from their cars. A local high school history class had visited twice, standing respectfully near the porch while Evelyn answered careful questions. She did not dramatize the story. She simply described what had been found and what had been preserved. Daniel did not return. He called once. The conversation was polite, measured. No accusations, no promises. Evelyn did not close the door on him, but she did not reopen what had been settled. Some distances were not made to be reversed. They were meant to be understood. One late afternoon, while she sat at the small desk she had salvaged and restored from the scrap pile, sunlight poured through the now properly framed window, illuminating dust motes that no longer felt intrusive. Rex lay near the hatch, as he always had. Guardian. She looked around the room. This had not been part of her plan. At 80, she had expected quiet decline, a smaller life, perhaps a corner in someone else's home. Instead, she had found herself in a valley no one wanted, inside a house no one would buy, standing above a truth no one had uncovered. She had been cast out. And in that space of removal, something else had emerged. Not revenge, not triumph. Revelation. She thought of the day she had stood on the curb in Ohio, suitcase in hand, watching the door close. She had believed something essential had been taken from her. Her place, her worth, her history. But standing here now, she understood something differently. Value is not granted by proximity. It is not secured by ownership of walls or deeds. It lives in what remains steady when everything else shifts. Her work had always mattered. Her discipline, her attention, her quiet understanding of patterns. Those things had not disappeared when the house in Ohio changed hands. They had followed her. They had led her here. Rex lifted his head and looked at her. "You knew before I did," she said softly. He thumped his tail once against the floor. The wind moved gently across the valley. The rail line lay silent but documented. The underground chamber rested secure beneath her home. Evelyn rose slowly and stepped onto the porch. The evening sky stretched wide and clear. She did not feel restored to something she had lost. She felt aligned with something she had always carried.
True value is not decided by who gives you or who lets you go. It is revealed in what you feel when no one is watching. And sometimes what is lost do not erase you. It leads the bed to what was on way waiting to be found. Rex stood beside her as the sun deep below the trees. The house that once stood in Hellstead, so steady and so deceit. Evelyn didn't get her own life back. She found something deeper beneath the one she lost. In a how no one wanted. Stand cover root, that quiet trend doesn't disappear just because someone closed the door on you. Sometimes, being yourself it was finally reveals what words only there. Have you ever had a moment in life where something painful unexpectedly led you somewhere better? Say it in the comments. Your story might be the one someone else needs to read today. And if stories like this speak to you, stay with us for the next one.